Hunger strips a person down to their marrow. It burns away pride, dignity, and whatever lies you tell yourself about who you are. She stood freezing on the porch of a man she didn't know, a giant, carved from the bitter mountains, drawn by the scent of roasted meat. She didn't expect salvation. She expected a boot to the ribs. So she asked for the bones. What he gave her instead changed the course of both their broken lives. Wind howled through the pines, a jagged sound that scraped against the eardrums and burrowed into the chest. Nora dragged her left foot forward, the worn leather of her boot little more than a suggestion against the biting snow. Ice crusted her eyelashes, welding them shut every time she blinked. She was 26 years old, though the last 3 weeks had aged her a decade. Her lungs burned with a metallic taste. Every breath was a negotiation with her own failing body. Emmett Caldwell had promised she would die if she ran. Standing over her in the mud of the cattle town, his spurs gleaming in the dull lantern light, he had sworn that the mountains would chew her up and spit out her bones. He owned the sheriff. He owned the saloon. He owned the boarding house, where she had scrubbed floors until her knuckles cracked and bled. And he thought he owned her. She had chosen the freezing mountains over his heavy, bruised hands. Now she was paying the price. Pine needles and packed snow offered no traction. She slipped her knee, slamming hard against a buried rock. Pain flared hot and sharp, briefly cutting through the numb haze enveloping her brain. Nora didn't cry out. Crying wasted energy. It wasted heat. She pushed herself up with hands that looked like claws, the skin mottled blue and stark white. Then she smelled it. Wood smoke. It was faint, heavily masked by the sharp scent of ozone and impending blizzard, but it was there. Underneath it lay something else. Animal fat. Sizzling meat. Her stomach shriveled into a tight, aching knot, gave a violent lurch. Saliva flooded her dry mouth. The instinct to survive, buried deep under layers of exhaustion and cynical resignation, clawed its way back to the surface. She followed the scent, stumbling blindly through a dense thicket of blue spruce, the branches tearing at her threadbare wool coat. A clearing opened before her. Sitting squat and sturdy against the side of a granite cliff was a cabin. It wasn't a temporary trapper's lean-to, but a fortress of thick, hand-hewn logs, chinked with hardened mud. A stone chimney belched thick grey smoke into the darkening sky. Yellow light bled from a single oil-papered window, spilling across the snow in a warm, inviting smear. Nora stared at it. She knew the rules of the frontier. A solitary cabin in the high country belonged to a solitary man. Solitary men out here were usually running from something, hiding from something, or too dangerous to live among polite society. Knocking on that door was a gamble with her life, but freezing to death in a snowbank was a certainty. She dragged herself across the clearing. The wind kicked up aggressively, shoving her toward the porch. She collapsed onto the rough-sawn planks, her knees giving out completely. The wood was solid beneath her. She raised a trembling fist and struck the heavy oak door. Once. Twice. The sound was pitifully weak over the roar of the wind. She waited. The silence from within was deafening. Maybe he was deaf. Maybe he was dead. Maybe he was standing on the other side with a shotgun leveled at her chest. The heavy iron latch clacked. The door swung inward, and the wind immediately tried to rip it from its hinges. A massive hand caught the wood, holding it steady. Nora looked up, her vision blurring at the edges. He was huge. That was her first coherent thought. A mountain of a man framed by the amber light of the hearth behind him. He wore a faded canvas shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms thick with muscle and dark hair smeared with fresh blood. A heavy leather apron hung over his chest. His beard was thick and untamed, flecked with grey, and his eyes were dark-shadowed beneath a heavy brow. He held a long, curved skinning knife in his right hand. He didn't speak. He just looked down at her. His gaze wasn't predatory, nor was it kind. It was calculating. He was assessing a problem that had just washed up on his porch. Nora tried to speak, but her jaw was locked with the cold. She forced her mouth open, the cracked skin of her lips splitting. A tiny bead of blood welled up. The smell of roasted venison rolling out of the cabin was agonizing. It filled her head, drowning out the fear, drowning out Emmett Caldwell's threats, drowning out everything but the primal need to eat. She didn't ask for refuge. She didn't ask for help. She knew what men demanded in exchange for such things, and she had nothing left to trade. Could I? Her voice was a rasping croak, stripped of all moisture. She swallowed hard, tasting her own blood. Could I have the scraps? The man's expression didn't change. The wind whipped his dark hair around his face. He looked at the knife in his hand, then back down at her trembling form. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a warm, comforting platitude. He stepped back, pulling the door wider. "Get inside before you let the cold in," he said. His voice was like a boulder grinding against gravel, deep rough, and entirely devoid of emotion. Nora didn't hesitate. She crawled over the threshold, her frozen skirts dragging against the floorboards. Heat hit her like a physical blow. It was overwhelming, almost suffocating after the icy void outside. She lay on the floor for a moment, just breathing it in. The cabin smelled of curing tobacco gun oil and roasting meat. It smelled like life. The heavy door slammed shut behind her, cutting off the howl of the wind. The sudden silence was jarring. The heavy thud of an iron bolt sliding into place echoed in the small room. "Get up," the man said. Nora scrambled to her feet, her legs shaking so violently she had to lean against the rough log wall to stay upright. She finally got a good look at the interior. It was meticulously clean. Rifles hung on the wall, their barrels gleaming with oil. Pelts were stacked neatly in the corner. A large iron stove dominated the center of the room, radiating intense heat. On top of it sat a massive cast-iron skillet, where thick cuts of meat seared in bubbling fat. He walked past her, ignoring her entirely, and went to a small wooden table. He tossed the bloody skinning knife into a bucket of water. He wiped his hands on a rag, his back to her. Nora stayed glued to the wall. She watched his broad shoulders, waiting for the inevitable demand. "Take off your coat. What are you doing out here? What can you do for me?" He said none of those things. Instead, he reached up to a shelf and pulled down a heavy glazed clay plate. He walked over to the stove. Nora's breath hitched. She watched as he took a long iron fork and stabbed the largest, most perfectly seared piece of venison in the pan. He dropped it onto the plate. The meat hissed hot fat pooling around the edges. Then he moved to a cast-iron Dutch oven sitting on the side of the stove. He lifted the lid, and a cloud of fragrant steam rose into the air. With a wooden spoon, he scooped out a massive portion of roasted potatoes, carrots, and thick, dark gravy, piling it next to the meat. He wasn't putting together scraps. He wasn't collecting the gristle and the bones. He carried the plate to the small wooden table. He set it down. Next to it he placed a tin cup. He poured steaming black coffee from a percolator into the cup, then grabbed a half loaf of heavy sourdough bread and slapped it onto the wood next to the plate. He pulled out one of the two chairs. Then he looked at her. "Sit." Nora stared at the food. Her mind, battered by weeks of cruelty and deprivation, couldn't process the image. She started, her voice breaking. "I don't have money. I don't have anything to give you." The mountain man crossed his arms over his massive chest. "Did I ask for money? Men don't give something for nothing." Nora said the cynicism hardening her voice, despite the violent trembling of her hands. "I know how this works. You feed me, and then you collect." He held her gaze. His eyes were a pale, striking grey in the firelight. They held no warmth, but they lacked the oily, hungry look she was so accustomed to seeing in Emmett Caldwell's eyes. "You can freeze out there if you prefer the honesty of the winter," he said, his tone flat. "Or you can sit down and eat. But I don't barter for basic decency, and I don't have the patience to argue with a starving woman." He turned his back on her again, walking over to the bucket to retrieve his knife. Nora pushed off the wall. The smell of the gravy was driving her out of her mind. She stumbled to the chair and sat down heavily. The plate was hot enough to radiate warmth into her freezing chest. She picked up the heavy iron fork. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip it. She took the first bite. It was an explosion of salt fat and rich, gamey flavor. The hot meat hit her shrunken stomach like a stone, sending a jolt of pure energy through her nervous system. She didn't chew properly. She swallowed it, almost whole, tears springing to her eyes, unbidden. The pain in her stomach was immediate, a sharp cramp, as her body struggled to handle the sudden intake of rich food after days of eating nothing but pine nuts and snow. She didn't care. She tore off a piece of the sourdough bread, dragging it through the gravy, shoving it into her mouth. She ate with the desperate, ugly ferocity of a stray dog. She expected him to watch her, to mock her, to demand gratitude. But when she finally stopped to gasp for air and take a sip of the scalding black coffee, she noticed he wasn't looking at her at all. He had pulled a whetstone from a drawer and was quietly sharpening the skinning knife, the rhythmic shh, shk, shh, shk sound filling the cabin. He was giving her the dignity of ignoring her while she made a spectacle of herself. Nora slowed down. She chewed the next piece of venison carefully. The warmth of the cabin was seeping into her bones, turning the sharp agony of the cold into a deep, heavy ache. The snow melted off her boots, forming a dark puddle on the clean floorboards. "I'm ruining your floor." She rasped her throat, feeling slightly less like sandpaper after the coffee. "Wood dries," he said, not looking up from the blade. Nora finished the plate. She wiped the last smudge of gravy with the crust of the bread and ate it. She felt physically heavy, weighed down by the food and the sudden crushing realization that she was safe. For now. She sat back in the chair, her eyelids drooping. The adrenaline that had kept her moving for the past 3 days was crashing hard. "My name is Nora," she said quietly into the silence. Nora Hayes. The mountain man paused his sharpening. He wiped the blade clean with an oiled rag, set it down, and finally looked at her. "Clayton," he said. That was it. No last name, no history. He stood up, towering over the table. Nora flinched instinctively, bracing herself. The meal was over. Now came the payment. Clayton stepped past her and went to the large bed built into the far corner of the cabin. It was a sturdy frame piled high with thick bear and wolf pelts. Nora watched him, her heart rate spiking. This was it. The temporary illusion of safety was shattering. She calculated the distance to the door, wondering if she had the strength to run, knowing full well she didn't. He grabbed a massive, heavy wolfskin blanket from the top of the pile. He turned and threw it onto a small, narrow cot situated near the stove. "Take your boots off," Clayton said. "If your feet are frostbit, keeping wet leather on them will rot the toes off by morning." Nora stared at the cot, then at the wolfskin blanket, then at him. He was walking back toward his own bed. You're letting me sleep there?" she asked, the suspicion thick in her throat. Clayton stopped. He turned his head slowly, looking at her over his shoulder. "Unless you prefer the floor. But the cot's closer to the fire." He sat on the edge of his bed and began unlacing his own heavy leather boots. Nora didn't move. "Why?" The single word hung in the air, heavy with all the cynical baggage of a woman who had learned the hard way that the world was a transactional place. Emmett had taught her that kindness was always bait. Clayton dropped his first boot to the floor with a heavy thud. He didn't answer immediately. He began working on the second lace. "You asked for scraps," he finally said, his voice low, blending with the crackle of the wood stove. "A dog eats scraps. You walked up a mountain in a blizzard. Takes a spine to do that. You earned a meal." He kicked the second boot off. "Sleep, Nora Hayes. I don't bite unless bitten." He lay back on his bed, pulling a blanket over himself, leaving his clothes on. Within minutes, his breathing slowed into the deep, rhythmic cadence of sleep. Nora sat frozen at the table for a long time. The wind battered the cabin walls, a violent reminder of the death waiting outside. She looked at the empty plate. She looked at the man sleeping in the corner. He had placed his rifle against the wall easily within his reach, but not aggressively positioned. Slowly, carefully, she reached down and unlaced her ruined boots. Her socks were soaked through with icy water. She peeled them off, wincing, as the raw, blistered skin of her heels caught on the wool. Her toes were pale, but they ached with returning circulation. Not frostbitten yet. She stood her joints popping in the quiet room. She walked over to the cot. She didn't take off her coat. She lay down on the thin mattress and pulled the heavy wolf skin over her. It smelled earthy and wild, but it trapped the heat from the stove perfectly. She expected to lie awake all night, staring at the ceiling, waiting for him to creep across the floorboards. She gripped the edge of the blanket tightly, ready to fight. But the food in her belly was a heavy anchor, pulling her down into darkness. The sheer physical exhaustion of outrunning Caldwell's men overrode her paranoia. The last thing she remembered was the sound of the wind failing to breach the thick log walls. When Nora woke, the cabin was filled with the thin grey light of morning. She bolted upright, her hand flying to her chest. Panic seized her for a fraction of a second before her surroundings registered. The smell of coffee was back. The fire in the stove was snapping aggressively. Clayton was sitting at the table. He was cleaning a massive revolver, the oiled parts laid out neatly on a rag. He wore the same expression as the night before, stoic, unbothered, intensely focused. Nora swung her legs over the edge of the cot. Her entire body screamed in protest. Every muscle felt bruised, every joint filled with broken glass. She gasped, grabbing her knee. Clayton glanced up, then went back to wiping the cylinder of the gun. "Coffee's on," he said. Nora pushed herself up, hobbling over to the stove. She poured herself a cup, the hot tin warming her hands. She stood by the iron stove, soaking in the heat, watching him reassemble the weapon with practiced fluid motions. The storm broke. Clayton noted, snapping the cylinder into place with a sharp metallic click. He spun it once, checking the action. Nora looked out the window. The snow had stopped, leaving a blindingly white, pristine landscape beneath a pale blue sky. The reality of her situation came crashing back. The storm was over. That meant she had to go. Caldwell's men might have stopped for the blizzard, but they would be looking for tracks now. "I'll be out of your way," Nora said quietly, looking down at her bare feet. "Soon as I can get my boots on. I appreciate the food. The fire." Clayton stood up. He slid the heavy revolver into a leather holster hanging from a peg on the wall. He turned and looked at her ruined boots sitting near the door. The leather was warped, the soles splitting away from the uppers. "You're not going anywhere in those," he said flatly. "Unless you plan on crawling." Nora's jaw tightened. "I'll manage. I always manage." Pride keeps you warm for about 10 minutes in this snow, Clayton replied. He walked over to a heavy wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He opened it, rummaging through the contents. He pulled out a pair of thick, fur-lined moccasin boots. They were men's boots, clearly too large for her, but vastly superior to her own. He tossed them across the room. They landed at Nora's feet. "Put those on," he ordered. Nora stared at the boots. The cynicism flared again. "I told you, I have nothing to pay you with." Clayton walked back to the table, picking up his coffee cup. He leaned against the heavy timber wall, his grey eyes locking onto hers. "Someone drove you up this mountain, Nora Hayes." Clayton said, his voice lacking any pity, dealing only in facts. "You're running scared. I can smell it on you. Whoever it is, they're likely tracking you. And if they track you here, they bring trouble to my door." He took a sip of his coffee. "You stay until you're strong enough to walk without leaving a trail of blood in the snow. You eat what I cook. You help chop the wood. And when you leave no trace." It wasn't an offer of charity. It was a pragmatic arrangement. He was keeping her alive because a dead woman on his property was an inconvenience, and a bleeding woman was a beacon for trouble. Nora looked at the boots. She looked at the gruff, solitary giant leaning against the wall. For the first time in weeks, she felt a microscopic crack in the ice around her heart. It wasn't warmth, but it was a start. She picked up the boots. "Where's the axe?" she asked. The handle of the splitting maul was smooth hickory, polished by years of friction against rough palms. To Nora, it felt like lifting an anvil. She stood at the chopping block behind the cabin, her breath pluming in the frigid morning air. The oversized moccasins Clayton had given her were stuffed with dried prairie grass to keep her heels from slipping, making her gait awkward and heavy. She swung the axe. The blade struck the frozen round of lodgepole pine with a dull thwack, biting barely an inch into the wood. The shockwave vibrated up the handle, rattling the bones in her forearms and sending a sharp ache through her shoulders. She wrenched the axe free and swung again. This time she missed the center, the blade glancing off the edge and burying itself in the dirt. "You're swinging with your back," a voice said. Nora didn't jump. She had spent the last 4 days learning that Clayton O'Rourke moved with a silence that defied his massive frame. He stood on the edge of the porch, a heavy canvas coat draped over his shoulders, watching her. He held a mug of coffee. He wasn't mocking her. He was observing a mechanical failure. "I'm swinging with what I have," Nora shot back, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of her gloved hand. The gloves were his 2 thick leather work gloves that made her hands look like bear paws. Clayton stepped off the porch. The snow crunched under his boots. He walked over, setting his mug on a stump, and held out his hand. Nora hesitated, then handed him the maul. "Watch the knees," Clayton said. He didn't square up like a boxer. He stood loose, relaxed. He lifted the heavy axe effortlessly, bringing it over his shoulder. He didn't strain. He just let gravity and the weight of the iron do the work, dipping his knees slightly at the exact moment of impact. The blade hit the pine round with a sharp crack, splitting the frozen wood perfectly in twain. The 2 halves tumbled into the snow. He handed the axe back. "Let the iron do the work. You're trying to muscle it. You don't have the muscle. Use the weight." He picked up his coffee and walked back into the cabin. He didn't wait to see if she succeeded. He had offered the instruction, and whether she took it or froze to death due to a lack of firewood was entirely up to her. Nora stared at the split wood. Emmett Caldwell would have shoved her aside, told her she was useless, and done it himself while cursing her existence. Clayton just showed her the mechanics of survival and left her to it. She picked up the maul. She set another round on the block. She lifted the iron, focused on the weight of the head, and bent her knees as it fell. The wood split. It wasn't clean, but it splintered enough to be usable. A fierce, unfamiliar spark of satisfaction ignited in her chest. She spent the next 2 hours filling the wood box, her muscles burning her lungs, stinging with the cold, but her mind remarkably clear. Life in the cabin settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the stove. It was a stark, brutal existence, stripped of all pleasantries. They rarely spoke. Clayton left before dawn most mornings to run his trap lines, returning midday, with rabbits, pine martens, or nothing at all. He moved with an economy of motion that fascinated her. There were no wasted steps. When he cooked, he used exactly enough salt. When he built a fire, he used exactly enough kindling. Nora healed. The blisters on her heels calloused. The hollows of her cheeks filled out, slightly fueled by steady meals of venison stew, dried beans, and heavy bread. The bone-deep chill that had nearly killed her slowly receded, replaced by a constant, manageable ache from the daily chores. She found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. The cabin held no clues to a past life, no photographs, no letters, no trinkets. Just tools, knives, rifles, traps, whetstones, cast-iron pots. It was the dwelling of a man who had intentionally stripped away everything that could tether him to the world below the timberline. One evening, as the wind rattled the oil paper window, Nora sat near the stove, stitching a tear in her wool coat with a bone needle and thick thread from Clayton's kit. He was at the table, meticulously oiling his trap springs. "You don't go into town," Nora said. It wasn't a question. Clayton didn't look up. Towns are full of people. People have supplies, sugar, coffee, ammunition. I trade pelts for what I need with a freighter down at the crossroads twice a year. Clayton replied, his thumb rubbing oil into the steel. I don't need sugar. Nora bit off the end of her thread. You just live up here, alone, waiting to die. The rhythmic sound of metal on metal stopped. Clayton set the trap down. He looked at her, his pale grey eyes catching the firelight. I'm not waiting to die, Nora. I'm making sure nobody else decides when it happens. He held her gaze for a long moment, and in that silence, Nora understood. He wasn't hiding from the law. He wasn't a simple hermit. He was a man who had realized that the only way to avoid being crushed by the weight of other men's ambitions was to remove himself from their reach entirely. Emmett Caldwell. Nora said the name tasting like ash in her mouth. He owns a cattle empire down in the basin. He bought the sheriff. He bought the judge. Clayton picked up another trap. Men like that usually do. I worked at his boarding house. He decided he wanted to own me, too. She looked down at her hands, the rough calluses forming on her palms. When I said no, he made sure I couldn't work anywhere else. Then he cornered me in the alley behind the saloon. He told me I was his. I broke a whiskey bottle over his face and ran. Clayton didn't offer sympathy. He didn't tell her it would be all right. Did you blind him? Clayton asked flatly. No, just cut up his cheek. Pity, Clayton muttered, testing the tension on the trap spring. A one-eyed tracker is easier to lose. The illusion of safety shattered on the 7th day. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the threat of fresh snow. Clayton had gone out early to check a snare line he'd set near a frozen creek bed about 2 miles down the ridge. Nora was inside scrubbing the cast-iron skillet with sand and a rag, the only method available to strip away the burned grease. She heard the crunch of boots on the porch. The door opened. Clayton didn't casually shake off the snow as he usually did. He stepped inside quickly, shutting the heavy door and throwing the iron bolt into place with a sharp clack. The sound sent a jolt of ice water straight down Nora's spine. He didn't speak. He walked directly to the gun rack. He took down a Henry repeating rifle, checked the action, and began feeding brass cartridges into the tubular magazine. "What is it?" Nora asked, her voice tight. She dropped the rag. "Smoke." Clayton said, his eyes fixed on the weapon in his hands. About 3 miles down the mountain. Thick, green wood. Somebody built a fire they didn't know how to build, or they built it in a hurry to keep from freezing. Trappers. Trappers know how to build a fire without signaling every living thing in a 5-mile radius, Clayton said. He set the loaded Henry on the table. He turned back to the wall and unhooked a heavy leather gun belt holding a Colt single-action army revolver. He walked over to Nora and held the belt out. Nora stared at the heavy iron and leather. Her breath went shallow. "I told you I hit him with a bottle. I don't know how to shoot." "You know how to point," Clayton said, shoving the belt into her hands. It was heavy, the brass cartridges lining the loops, weighing it down. "It's a single action. You have to pull the hammer back with your thumb before you pull the trigger. Don't aim for the head. Aim for the center of the chest. It's a bigger target." Nora gripped the leather, her knuckles turning white. "You think it's him? I think Caldwell is a man whose pride you injured," Clayton said, moving to the window and peering through a small scratch in the oiled paper. "Men with money and injured pride don't let things go. They hire men who don't mind the cold." "How many?" 4 distinct tracks cutting up through the pass. Horses couldn't make it past the tree line, so they're on foot. They're slow, they're loud, and they're angry. Clayton turned away from the window. "They'll be here before nightfall." Panic, pure and unadulterated, seized Nora's chest. It was the same panic she had felt in the alleyway, the suffocating realization that a cage was dropping over her. She looked at the door, then at the single window. "I have to leave," she blurted out, her voice rising in pitch. "If I go out the back, if I head higher up the ridge—" "You'll die." Clayton interrupted his voice, a sharp whip crack in the quiet cabin. "The snow is 3 feet deep in the drifts up there. You don't have snowshoes. You'll exhaust yourself in an hour, and they'll follow the trough you carve through the powder, right to you." "They'll kill you if I stay," Nora yelled, stepping toward him. "He doesn't care who you are. He just wants me to suffer." Clayton walked over to the heavy wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He kicked the lid open. "I don't care what he wants. He's bringing armed men onto my ridge." He pulled out a box of ammunition and slammed it onto the table. "I built this cabin. I felled the trees. I dragged the stone for the chimney. I don't run from my own fire." He looked at her, his expression harder than she had ever seen it. It was the look of a predator defending its territory. "Buckle the belt," Clayton ordered. Nora fumbled with the heavy brass buckle. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely thread the leather. She finally got it secured around her waist, the heavy holster slapping clumsily against her thigh. It felt alien, terrifying. Clayton walked to the stove and opened the heavy iron door. He grabbed a metal bucket of water and threw it inside. A massive hiss filled the room as thick, choking steam billowed out, killing the flames instantly. "What are you doing?" Nora coughed, waving the ash away from her face. "Killing the smoke," Clayton said. "No sense giving them a beacon right to the door. We want them guessing the last half-mile." The temperature in the cabin began to drop almost immediately. The residual heat of the iron stove wouldn't last long against the bitter chill radiating through the walls. Clayton moved to the door, checking the heavy iron bolt. He took the Henry rifle from the table and pulled a heavy wooden chair into the darkest corner of the room, facing the door and the window. He sat down, laying the rifle across his knees. He looked completely relaxed, a stark contrast to the coiled spring of violence radiating from him. "Get behind the stove," Clayton told her. "The iron will stop a bullet. The logs will stop a bullet. The door won't." Nora moved behind the massive cast-iron block. She crouched down on the floorboards, pulling the Colt from the holster. It was incredibly heavy. She pulled the hammer back with a loud click. Her thumb ached from the tension of the spring. Silence descended on the cabin. It was an oppressive, heavy silence, broken only by the whistling of the wind outside and the frantic, shallow rhythm of Nora's own breathing. She stared at the sliver of light coming from beneath the heavy oak door. "Clayton," she whispered at the sound, barely carrying across the room. "Quiet your breathing." His voice came from the shadows, calm, rhythmic, and deadly flat. "Save your air. Don't look at the door. Look at the shadows on the floor. You'll see them break the light before they touch the handle." Nora lowered her eyes. She focused on the thin yellow line of daylight bleeding under the doorframe. She waited. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting to be rescued, and she wasn't waiting to be a victim. She gripped the heavy Colt, feeling the cold steel warming against her palms. An hour passed. The cabin grew bitterly cold. Nora's breath plumed in the air. Her legs cramped painfully from crouching, but she didn't dare move. Then the light under the door flickered. A shadow passed over it. Then another. The heavy crunch of boots on the snow-packed porch broke the silence. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was heavy, deliberate footsteps. A fist hammered against the oak door, shaking the hinges. "Open it up!" A muffled, harsh voice yelled from outside. "We know you're in there. Hayes Caldwell wants his property back, and we ain't leaving till we get it." Nora's grip on the revolver tightened until her knuckles ached. She looked toward the dark corner where Clayton sat. He didn't say a word. Slowly, silently, he raised the Henry rifle to his shoulder. "Burn it down, then." A second voice yelled, the sound muffled by the thick oak, but sharp enough to carry over the wind. "Ain't no skin off my nose if she comes back as ash. Caldwell just wants proof she's dead." Heavy boots shifted on the porch boards. They were crowding the entrance, emboldened by the dead silence from within. To them, the lack of a response meant fear. They thought they had trapped a terrified woman, and whatever poor, foolish prospector, she had manipulated into hiding her. They didn't know they had cornered a wolf in its own den. Clayton tracked the creaking floorboards of the porch with his ears. He didn't look at the door. He kept his eyes focused on the empty air in front of him, his head tilted slightly. He was calculating mass distance and the penetrating power of a .44 caliber slug through 3 inches of solid oak. "Last chance, old man," the first voice barked, punctuated by the heavy thud of a rifle butt striking the doorframe. "Send her out and we let you keep your scalp." Clayton exhaled slowly. His finger tightened on the trigger. The rifle roared, a deafening explosion that sucked the remaining oxygen from the small room. A blinding flash of yellow flame illuminated Clayton's stoic face for a fraction of a second. The heavy lead slug punched through the thick oak door, right below the iron handle, sending a shower of sharp wooden splinters into the cabin. Outside, the arrogant shouting dissolved instantly into a wet, breathless gargle. A heavy weight slammed against the exterior of the door and slid down the wood with a sickening, heavy scrape. Chaos erupted. "He shot Miller! The bastard! Shot Miller!" Gunfire answered immediately. 3 distinct rifles opened up, tearing into the front of the cabin. The noise was apocalyptic. Lead slugs slammed into the massive pine logs with deep, vibrating thuds. A bullet found a weak spot in the hardened mud, chinking, whistling through the gap and shattering a clay jug resting on a shelf above the table. Shards of pottery rained down, clattering against the floorboards. Nora curled into a tight ball behind the cast-iron stove, her hands clamped over her ears. The sound was a physical weight pressing down on her skull. Acrid, sulphurous smoke immediately began to fill the confined space, stinging her eyes and burning the back of her throat. Clayton racked the lever of the Henry. The brass casing ejected with a sharp metallic clink, spinning through the smoke before hitting the floor. He didn't stay in the corner. He moved. He was a massive man, but he glided across the floorboards, staying low, keeping beneath the trajectory of the incoming fire. He reached the window. The oiled paper was already tearing from the wind and the pressure of the gunshots. He didn't break it out entirely. He used the edge of his rifle barrel to poke a small hole through the thickest part of the paper, giving himself a narrow line of sight. Another volley of lead slammed into the logs. They were firing blind, emptying their magazines in a panic. Clayton waited. He let them waste their ammunition. He let the echoes die down in the valley. "Reloading!" someone shouted from the tree line just beyond the clearing. They had retreated off the porch, seeking the cover of the dense blue spruces. Clayton adjusted his stance. Through the tiny tear in the paper, he caught a flash of movement, a heavy wool coat darting between two massive pine trunks. He tracked the gap between the trees. He didn't rush. He breathed in, held it, and fired. A sharp cry of pain echoed from the trees, followed by the clatter of a dropped rifle. My leg, son of a bitch, shattered my knee. 2 down, 2 left. Nora peered around the edge of the iron stove. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but the paralyzing grip of total panic was beginning to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp adrenaline. She looked at Clayton. He was a machine methodical and entirely devoid of fear. He levered another round into the chamber, the brass flashing in the dim light. "They're separating," Clayton said, his voice surprisingly calm, carrying clearly under the ringing in Nora's ears. "One is dragging the wounded man back. The other is flanking. He's going to circle around to the blind side. Keep your eyes on the back wall." Nora tightened her grip on the heavy Colt revolver. She shifted her weight, ignoring the sharp cramp in her thigh, and turned her attention to the solid wall of logs behind the bed. There were no windows there, just wood and mud. "How do we see him?" Nora whispered, her voice rasping. "We don't," Clayton replied, his eyes scanning the tree line out front. "We listen." The wind howled, rattling the roof shingles and masking the subtle sounds of the forest. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. The smell of cordite was suffocating a thick fog that settled near the floor. Nora's eyes watered, but she didn't dare blink. She stared at the back wall until the grain of the wood began to swim in her vision. Then she heard it. It wasn't a footstep. It was the sound of snow compressing under a heavy weight, followed by the faint scrape of metal against rough bark. Someone was leaning against the back of the cabin right outside. Nora pointed the trembling barrel of the Colt toward the sound. "He's out back," she hissed. Clayton didn't turn around. "He wants you to shoot through the wall and waste your bullet. Keep your iron down. He has to find a way in." Silence fell over the mountain again, thick and deceptive. The man with the shattered knee had stopped screaming, likely passed out from the shock or gagged by his partner. The temperature in the cabin continued to plummet. Without the stove burning, the bitter chill of the high country seeped through the floorboards, biting into Nora's bones. She kept the heavy revolver leveled, her thumb resting on the grooved hammer. Her arms ached from the weight. Thump. The sound came from the roof. Nora gasped, her eyes darting upward. The ceiling was made of thick, rough-sawn planks, heavily insulated with packed earth and snow. "He climbed the woodpile," Clayton stated, not taking his eyes off the front window. "He's trying to find the chimney. If he dropped down the chimney, or dropped a bundle of burning pitch pine down it, they would be smoked out in seconds." Clayton finally turned away from the window. He set the Henry rifle against the table and drew a long, vicious-looking hunting knife from the sheath on his belt. He looked up at the ceiling, tracking the faint, muffled sounds of the man crawling across the pitch of the roof. The footsteps stopped directly over the hearth. "Stay behind the stove," Clayton commanded, moving silently toward the fireplace. A shower of soot and dried snow fell down the dark stone shaft of the chimney, puffing into the room. A pair of heavy snow-covered boots appeared in the dark opening, dangling as the man tried to lower himself down the flue. He was struggling his heavy winter coat, catching on the rough stones. Clayton didn't hesitate. He stepped into the hearth, reached up with one massive hand, and grabbed the man by the ankle. With a brutal, terrifying display of raw strength, Clayton yanked downward. A muffled yell echoed down the stones. The man's grip slipped. He plummeted down the chimney, a tangle of limbs, heavy wool and falling soot. He slammed into the iron grate at the bottom with a sickening crunch. A cloud of black ash exploded outward, completely obscuring the fireplace. Before the man could even gasp for air, Clayton was on him. He dragged the intruder out of the ash by the collar of his coat, hurling him onto the wooden floorboards. The man thrashed, hacking violently, reaching for a revolver tucked into his waistband. Clayton brought the heavy heel of his boot down on the man's wrist. The bone snapped with a sharp crack. The man screamed a high, reedy sound of absolute agony. Clayton kicked the dropped gun across the floor, then placed the tip of his hunting knife directly beneath the man's jaw, pressing upward, just enough to draw a bead of dark blood. "Quiet," Clayton growled. The man froze his eyes wide with terror, his chest heaving as he stared up at the giant looming over him. He was young, his face smeared with soot and sweat. "Where is the fourth man?" Clayton asked, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. The young man swallowed hard, wincing as the blade pressed against his throat. "He ran. When you shot Davis in the knee, he took off back down the trail." Clayton held the knife steady for another long second. Then he stepped back, wiping the blade on his trousers. He grabbed the young man by his unbroken arm and hauled him roughly to his feet. "Pick up your dead man off my porch," Clayton ordered, shoving him toward the door. "You drag him, and you drag your crippled friend down the mountain. If I see you stop, if I see you turn around, I will put a bullet through the back of your skull from a mile away. Do you understand me?" The man nodded frantically, cradling his broken wrist against his chest. Clayton unbolted the heavy oak door and kicked it open. The bitter wind rushed in, instantly clearing the smoke and cordite from the room. The body of the first man lay curled on the porch, a dark pool of blood, frozen solid beneath him. The young man stumbled out, sobbing, and began the grisly task of dragging his dead companion into the snow. Clayton stood in the doorway, the Henry rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm, watching until the two men disappeared into the trees, leaving a wide, bloody trough in the pristine snow. Only when the forest was entirely silent again did he step back inside and pull the door shut. He didn't bolt it this time. He walked over to the table and set the rifle down. He leaned heavily against the wood, his broad shoulders rising and falling in a slow, exhausted rhythm. Nora slowly lowered the hammer of the Colt. Her hands were shaking so violently, she nearly dropped the heavy weapon. She placed it carefully on the floorboards and stood up. Her legs felt like water. She looked at the blood on the porch, the soot scattered across the floor, and the broken pottery. The sanctity of the cabin had been violated. Emmett Caldwell's reach had found her even up here. She looked at Clayton. He was staring at the cold iron stove, his face an unreadable mask. "They'll come back," Nora said, her voice hollow. "He'll send more. He won't stop until I'm dead." Clayton turned his head slowly. The adrenaline had faded, leaving his pale grey eyes looking ancient and incredibly tired. He reached down and touched his left side. When he pulled his hand away, the thick leather glove was smeared with fresh crimson blood. Nora gasped, taking a step toward him. "You're hit. Splinter!" Clayton said dismissively, though his voice lacked its usual granite solidity. From the door, it caught me under the ribs. He unbuttoned the heavy canvas coat and pulled up his blood-soaked shirt. A jagged dark piece of oak as thick as a man's thumb was buried deep in his side, just above the hip bone. Blood pulsed sluggishly around the wound. Nora felt the world tilt. The stoic, unbreakable mountain man was bleeding, and it was because of her. She had brought this violence to his doorstep. She had traded her survival for his safety. "Sit down," Nora ordered, a sudden fierce clarity cutting through her lingering panic. "Sit down before you bleed out on your own floor." Clayton looked at her mild surprise, registering on his rugged face. He didn't argue. He pulled a chair out and sat heavily, his breath hitching slightly as the wood shifted in his flesh. "We need boiling water," Nora said, rushing to the stove. She grabbed the heavy iron bucket, ignoring the soot, and shoved it back into the firebox. She grabbed a handful of kindling and struck a match. "And whatever you have for bandages, bottom drawer of the chest." Clayton grunted, his hand pressing tightly against his side. "There's a bottle of whiskey on the shelf." Nora moved with a frantic, desperate energy. She wasn't helpless anymore. She had asked for the scraps, and he had served her a feast of survival. Now the debt was being called in. She pulled clean rags from the chest, grabbed the bottle of harsh rye whiskey, and laid the hunting knife on the table. She stood over him, looking down at the jagged piece of wood buried in his side. She had scrubbed floors, washed dishes, and endured the cruelty of men. She had never dug shrapnel out of a human being. "Pour the whiskey on it," Clayton instructed, his voice tight with pain. "Then get the pliers from the toolbox." Nora uncorked the bottle. She didn't hesitate. She poured the amber liquid directly over the wound. Clayton's jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck standing out like steel cables, but he didn't make a sound. She found the iron pliers. She wiped them down with whiskey, her hand steadying. She looked into Clayton's eyes. They were hard-focused and entirely trusting. "Hold on to the table," Nora said quietly. She gripped the jagged end of the splinter with the heavy iron teeth. She took a deep breath, braced her feet against the floorboards, and pulled. Muscle tore, a wet, sickening sound that made Nora's stomach heave. She didn't stop. She locked her wrists and hauled backward with everything she had. The jagged oak splinter slid free, followed instantly by a dark, heavy rush of blood. Clayton let out a low, guttural grunt, his fingers digging into the thick wood of the table until his knuckles turned white. He didn't pass out. He breathed heavily through his nose, his eyes squeezed shut. "Pack it," he ground out. Nora grabbed the clean linen rags. She folded them thick and pressed them hard against the gaping hole in his side. He flinched, his core muscles seizing. She leaned her entire body weight into her hands, using her own small frame to apply maximum pressure. The whiskey bottle sat uncorked, filling the air with a sharp medicinal sting that mingled with the metallic odor of open veins. For 20 minutes, neither of them moved. The wind beat against the logs outside. The fire in the stove slowly caught the new kindling, sending warmth creeping back into the freezing room. "Lift it," Clayton whispered. Nora eased the pressure. The bleeding had slowed to a sluggish seep. "Needle," he said. She looked at the bone needle resting near the thread. She had used it to mend her coat. Now she was going to mend a man. She threaded it with trembling fingers. Clayton watched her, his pale grey eyes entirely clear despite the trauma his body had just endured. "Skin is thicker than wool," he told her, his voice hoarse. "You have to push hard. Don't hesitate, or it hurts worse." Nora nodded. She didn't offer a comforting lie. She pinched the edges of the ragged wound together and drove the needle through. Clayton hissed, his jaw locking. She pulled the thick thread tight, tying a crude, heavy knot. 6 stitches later, the flesh was sealed. "I'll help you to the bed," Nora said. He didn't argue. That alone told her how close to the edge he was. He leaned heavily on her shoulder, his massive frame nearly driving her to her knees. They managed the few steps to the heavy timber bed. He collapsed onto the furs. Night fell like a shroud. The fever came shortly after. Clayton burned. He tossed beneath the wolfskin blanket, muttering disjointed sentences in a language Nora didn't recognize. It sounded harsh, guttural. She stayed awake, feeding the stove, until the iron glowed dull red boiling water to clean the rags and pressing cool, snow-dampened cloths to his forehead. She sat beside him on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest, the heavy Colt revolver resting in her lap. She was the guard now. If Caldwell's men returned tonight, there would be no clever ambushes. There would only be her 6 rounds of heavy lead and the door. Near dawn, the fever broke. Clayton's breathing leveled out, shifting from frantic, shallow gasps to a deep, even rhythm. Nora leaned her head back against the log wall. She looked at the man sleeping in the bed. He had risked everything for a starving stranger who showed up on his porch asking for bones. He didn't ask for her life story. He didn't demand her obedience. He just offered a plate of food and a shared fire. She stood up, her joints aching. She walked to the window and peered through the torn, oiled paper. The mountain was silent, painted in stark shades of silver and blue by the setting moon. Emmett Caldwell would not let this go. 2 of his men were dead or maimed. The insult was too profound. He would come himself next time, and he would bring a posse large enough to burn the entire ridge. Nora looked down at the Colt in her hand. She thumbed the hammer back, feeling the heavy click. She wasn't going to wait to be burned. 3 days passed in tense, agonizing silence. The winter sun offered a brittle, blinding light, but no real warmth. Clayton healed with the stubborn resilience of an old bear. On the 3rd morning, he was sitting at the table cleaning the Henry rifle. He moved slowly, wincing when he twisted his torso, but the unnatural pallor had left his face. "He's coming," Clayton said, wiping the action with an oiled rag. "The storm holding the basin cleared yesterday. They'll make the trek today." "I know," Nora replied. She was sitting by the stove, loading fresh brass cartridges into the heavy leather belt. "We don't fight them in the cabin," Clayton stated, setting the rifle down. "If they bring enough men, they'll just surround it and starve us out or burn us out. We take the high ground at the Narrows. The pass is a bottleneck. Only 2 men can walk abreast through the rocks. We stop them there, or we don't stop them at all." Nora stood up and buckled the gun belt around her waist. It didn't feel alien anymore. It felt like a necessary weight. "We go now." They left the cabin, stepping out into the blinding white. The cold was a physical barrier shoving against them. They hiked for an hour, climbing higher up the ridge until the trees thinned, giving way to jagged granite spires jutting from the snow. This was the Narrows, a steep, treacherous cut in the rock that served as the only accessible path from the valley below. Clayton positioned himself behind a massive boulder, resting the barrel of the Henry against the freezing stone. He had a clear line of sight straight down the pass. He pointed to a smaller outcropping, 20 yards above him, slightly offset. "Get up there," Clayton instructed. "Stay flat. Don't shoot unless they breach my line. If I go down, you run higher into the crags. You don't surrender. Caldwell doesn't take prisoners. He takes trophies." Nora climbed. The rocks tore at her gloves, the wind screaming through the funnel of the pass, ripping the heat straight from her lungs. She reached the ledge and flattened herself against the snow, drawing the Colt. She had a perfect view of the trail and of Clayton below her. They waited. The mountain was entirely indifferent to their survival. An hour past noon, the first dark shapes appeared against the snow far below. They were moving slowly, struggling through the deep drifts. There were 5 of them. At the center of the group, wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat, rode a man on a massive black gelding. The horse was floundering chest-deep in the powder, but the rider whipped it mercilessly onward. Emmett Caldwell. Nora's stomach twisted into a tight, agonizing knot. Even from this distance, she recognized the broad shoulders, the arrogant posture, the sheer brutality radiating from him. The group reached the base of the Narrows. The henchman on foot balked at the steep, icy incline. "Move!" Caldwell's voice echoed up the canyon walls, thick with rage. "You want to get paid. You drag that bastard out of his hole, and you bring the girl to me. I don't care if she's missing a few fingers from the frost. Just bring her." Two men started up the narrow path, their rifles at the ready eyes, scanning the rocks. Clayton didn't let them get far. He didn't fire a warning shot. He exhaled his finger, squeezing the trigger. The Henry cracked a sharp, flat sound that bounced violently off the granite. The lead man folded instantly, tumbling backward down the icy slope and taking his partner with him in a tangle of limbs and dropped weapons. Panic erupted below. Caldwell spurred his exhausted horse, trying to force it up the incline, drawing a long-barreled revolver. "Get up there and kill him!" Caldwell screamed, firing wildly into the rocks. The bullets shattered against the granite, showering Clayton with chips of stone. The remaining three men scrambled for cover behind the rocks at the base of the pass. They laid down a frantic, suppressing fire. The air was filled with the deafening roar of gunpowder and the sharp whine of ricochets. Clayton stayed low. He worked the lever of the Henry, picking his shots with terrifying precision. He clipped one man in the shoulder, sending him crawling back down the trail in a bloody panic. Caldwell realized his men were breaking. Rage overtook whatever tactical sense he possessed. He dismounted, kicking the exhausted horse aside, and began trudging up the Narrows himself. He used the suppressing fire of his last two men to cover his advance, moving quickly between the large boulders. Clayton leaned out to take a shot, but a bullet slapped the rock inches from his face, forcing him back down. He grabbed his side, a fresh stain of red blooming on the canvas bandage. The sudden movement had torn the stitches. Caldwell was moving fast, driven by pure malice. He slipped past Clayton's line of sight, using the curve of the granite to shield himself. He was advancing up the blind side of Clayton's boulder. Nora watched from above. Her heart hammered against her ribs, threatening to crack them. She saw Caldwell creeping up the icy rock, his revolver raised, aiming directly for the spot where Clayton was pinned. In 10 seconds, Caldwell would have a clear shot at the back of Clayton's head. She didn't think. The time for surviving by running was over. Nora stood up. She stepped to the very edge of her ledge, completely exposing herself to the pass below. "Caldwell!" The shout tore from her throat, cutting through the gunfire and the wind. It wasn't the terrified squeak of a victim. It was the harsh, jagged sound of the mountain itself. Emmett Caldwell stopped. He snapped his head upward, his eyes widening in shock as he spotted her standing against the grey sky. He raised his revolver, his lips peeling back in a savage grin. Nora didn't flinch. She gripped the heavy Colt with both hands, thumbed the hammer back, aimed center mass, and pulled the trigger. The recoil shoved her backward. The gunshot was a thunderclap. Caldwell's chest caved inward. The heavy .44 caliber slug struck him with the force of a mule kick. He stood frozen for a fraction of a second, his arrogant grin dissolving into an expression of utter incomprehension. Then his knees buckled. He fell backward, his heavy body sliding down the icy chute of the Narrows, tumbling over the rocks, until he came to a stop at the bottom, entirely still. The two remaining henchmen stopped firing. They looked at the broken body of their employer, then up at the rocks, where death rained down from both sides. They dropped their rifles, turned, and fled back down the mountain, plunging desperately through the snow. Silence crashed back over the canyon. The wind whistled through the spires, sweeping away the gun smoke. Nora lowered the Colt. Her arms were numb. She looked down at the body in the snow. The terror that had haunted her every waking moment for weeks simply evaporated. It was gone replaced by the profound, exhausted weight of survival. She scrambled down the icy rocks, slipping and sliding until she reached Clayton's boulder. He was sitting against the granite, his hand pressed hard against his bleeding side. He looked up at her, the smoking Henry rifle resting across his knees. He looked from her to the empty pass and back to the heavy revolver in her hand. A slow, rough breath escaped his chest. It wasn't a smile, but the hard lines around his eyes softened just a fraction. "That was a hell of a shot," Clayton murmured. Nora holstered the Colt. She reached out, offering him her hand. "Let's go home. You need fresh bandages." Clayton gripped her hand, his massive fingers wrapped around hers, pulling himself up. He leaned on her slightly, accepting the support without hesitation. They walked back down the ridge together, two solitary figures moving through the pristine white. They didn't speak of the future. The high country didn't demand promises. It only demanded strength, fire, and the willingness to stand your ground. Nora had walked up the mountain a starving beggar, begging for bones. She was walking down a partner having claimed her place at the feast. Nora asked for scraps, but found survival and perhaps something more in the brutal, unforgiving high country. But a mountain man's solitary peace never lasts when the past comes hunting. Emmett Caldwell isn't a man who lets his property just walk away into the snow. Will Clayton stand his ground against an army of hired guns, or will Nora be forced to face the devil she ran from?